Although there are a very small number of situations where foreign interference may have had some impact on the outcome of a nomination contest or the result of an election in a given riding, foreign interference did not impact the outcome of the last 2 general elections.
Democratic institutions were tested, she says, but they largely held in spite of foreign interference. That doesn't mean, however, there were no problems.
The government sometimes took too long to act, and coordination was not always optimal.
Those failings were widespread across the government and its intelligence agencies. However, the judge says they were systemic, not political or malicious, and not done in collusion with a foreign power to advance the Liberals' political interests. Justice Hogue also offered blunt assessments on some lingering questions raised over the past 2 years. She explicitly states that former Liberal MP Han Dong did not urge China to extend the detention of Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig. There is no evidence that any money from the Chinese government made its way to 11 candidates in the 2019 election. And as for that explosive report suggesting there was a list of parliamentarians accused of conspiring with foreign actors, Hogue says there is no list of names and no evidence of treason.
Nor have I seen any evidence to suggest that there are currently so-called traitors in Parliament. While I saw evidence of some concerning behavior, the evidence does not show any MPs plotting with foreign states against Canada's interests.
And finally, a warning that the issues that dominated Parliament and media these past years and months are not the biggest threats to Canadian democracy. Instead, it's what you watch and read online.
The impact of traditional methods should not be underestimated, but the greatest threat, the one that I believe threatens the very existence of our democracy, is disinformation.
2 former CSIS directors are here with me to talk about this, Ward Elcock and Richard Fadden. Gentlemen, it's good to see you both. You've been with us throughout this. It's good to have you here on the day of the final release.
Pleasure to be here.
Ward Elcock, your big takeaways from this today, from the final report from Justice Hogue.
Oh, I think probably the biggest takeaway is that most of the coverage of the last 2 years is probably mostly inaccurate. I guess the second one would be her recognition that transnational repression is in fact probably a bigger problem than foreign interference in the political system. I've always thought that is probably more serious and in some ways harder to deal with, but it is a serious issue.
Dick Fadden, what are your thoughts on that? Do you agree with Ward that a lot of the media, I guess not of the inquiry itself, but maybe the media coverage that led to this inquiry was wrong?
A lot of it was based on imperfect information. A lot of it came from the government, from NSI COP. I think there's a lot of blame to be spread around, that explains how we got to where we are. I guess one major thing comes out of this for me is that mis and disinformation is going to be the problem that's with us now and for a long time to come, not just in terms of dealing with our democratic institutions much more broadly. The government has shown itself unable or unwilling to deal with it, and I think it's going to take more than this report to move them along.
Well, let's just talk a little bit about some of her recommendations here, because she does, you both were the top person at CSIS. There's some pretty blunt recommendations. Ward, start with you, that if you're going to say something to government, make it clear, make it plain, offer an assessment, improve that. And the government needs to improve its information flows, the way it communicates to Canadians about what's going on. Basically, she's calling for a big culture shift in how we deal with top secret information and intelligence in this country.
I think she's doing that, but I think what she's really pointing out, without necessarily saying it directly, is that we don't have a culture of national security. It's something I've said before. Mm-hmm. If you don't have a culture of national security, you don't have people who can understand what you send up to them. If you don't have a culture of national security, you don't have a group of people who understand what's important and what's not important. So in some sense, well, CSIS can probably always improve whatever it sends up the line. If you're not sending it up to somebody who understands what you're talking about, then actually it's not actually going to be very useful.
Right. So Dick, what do you make of that? Because, you know, there is this inability. While Justice Hogue does say that a lot of what people learned about foreign interference came from media reports based on intelligence, which may have been misconstrued or even inaccurate, that shouldn't be the first time you hear about a lot of this stuff publicly. It should come from government, and there should be an openness and a willingness to speak about these challenges.
I agree with what Ward has just said. We are lacking a national security culture, and I think it's been worse under Mr. Trudeau's government. They simply haven't been terribly interested in national security. CSIS can certainly improve, and I would maintain, though, that there is some blame to be laid at the feet of officials in national security. If they were convinced that there was a real problem, there are ways of jumping up and down and making yourself heard. We have a national security advisor, we have a public service minister, there are any number of devices. Having said that, if by now, well before now, CSIS and public safety and everybody else hasn't been actively trying to find ways to implement already what she's recommending, very dismaying.
She suggests, Dick Fadden, that there were delays, there was slow response, there was lack of information flow, but she has concluded that these were systemic challenges rather than deliberate acts or choices made for the political benefit of the government of the day. Do you think that conclusion holds up with everything we've heard?
I'm not sure. I think to some degree it does. I mean, you can't clearly identify surgically every piece of information that should or shouldn't have gone. But, you know, I think back to, you know, the testimony before, I think her first report by the 3 or 4 people from the Prime Minister's office who went to considerable length to try and explain how they saw everything, the Prime Minister saw everything, but they just didn't believe it. That's a bit out of sync with what she's saying. So I think there's blame to be shared all around here. And it's not it is systemic, but it's also, I think, in some instances, the result of individuals making judgments that this is not the most opportune time to move something forward.
Ward, what do you think?
I'd agree with Dick. I think there is a real challenge. Again, going back to the issue of not having a national security culture. If people don't understand what you're sending them, then they're suspicious of what you send them. They think that what you send them is questionable, and because they're questioning, sometimes you get it wrong too. You don't explain it in a way which they can understand. So you send it up in the way which you think is the most effective, but there's not an interchange going on between the two sides, between the people who are receiving the information, the people who are sending it up, that allows you to understand what one is sending, what one is understanding, and have a conversation about it so you can actually get better at it. It was 2 separate worlds. The CSIS sending things up to the politicians and senior officials who didn't really understand what they were saying.
So there are recommendations, Ward, just to stick with you, on how to shift some of this going forward. Just various ways for the way CSIS writes and who it's shared with, and so they can understand it better. But also, leaders should get security clearance, which has been an ongoing controversy this Parliament. But they say, and also 2 representatives from the political parties should find a way to get security clearance so there can be a more active and deliberate flow of information and responding to things outside of just the election period. Would that help bridge some of this challenges, this divide, do you think?
It will help with the political parties, so there's no question about that. I think it also helps if the leaders have clearances, and frankly, there really is no reason, unless your goal is not to have information so you can say whatever you want.
Right.
It really doesn't make any sense not to have a clearance. Whether it solves the broader problems, I think it deals with the parties, but I don't think it does much for the broader issues between politicians, the bureaucrats, and the intelligence agencies.
Dick, what do you think?
Yeah, I take that, but I think there's the one thing that would change this culture schmulture is if the Prime Minister of the day is interested in our highly hierarchical system, highly tightly controlled system. If the Prime Minister consistently demonstrates that he is interested in this, believe you me, the system will respond. But you need a Prime Minister who is interested over time. I don't think we've had that for a while now.
That's very personality dependent, though, right?
Absolutely.
Like it seems like that, and that is important. But you probably you need something structural in case you have a prime minister who is that interested.
You do everything
correct?
that Ward has talked about.
Right, okay.
If need be, you hire editors to redo CSIS's material.
Right.
You make sure that the NSA is much more involved in making sure that there's a communication that's effective. If need be, you involve the clerk. But in the end, you should do all of these things. But if the Prime Minister is not interested, you can create a National Security Council, you can do all sorts of things. You will still just chug along at roughly the same rate we're going now, I would argue.
And I think Dick's right.
Yeah,
It really, a lot of it does come down to what the message that the Prime Minister sends. The clerk can change some of that to some extent by driving it in the public service. But that won't fix it if the Prime Minister's not interested.
Okay, so we have a situation here, though, where Justice Hogue is also, just to broaden it out to the actual examination of how it affected the Canadian democratic systems. It's almost identical in its conclusions. Dick, start with you to what David Johnston told us, right? The 2019 and 2020 elections, there were efforts, might have played a role in nominations and in specific ridings, but not to the heart of the integrity of both of those races. And for the most part, it hasn't been that effective. And on the NSI COP report that had people calling for names to be named and allegations of treason, Justice Hogue concludes that NSI COP was too firm in its conclusions because it drew stronger opinions than the evidence suggested or the intelligence suggested, or the intelligence was wrong. Where does this leave us in our understanding of what's happened?
It's an interesting question because NSI COP has access to all classified information that she had access to. All information, diplomatic reporting, media reporting, and intelligence is susceptible of more than one interpretation. But what worries me about this, despite I agree with your characterization from David Johnston on down, there's reality and there's the perception of reality.
Right.
And we're also dealing with the perception of reality right now. And I don't care if the Supreme Court unanimously holds that everything that she says is gospel, until we find a way of sort of getting this trickle into the Canadian consciousness through work that you and your colleagues will do, that academics will do, some people in Parliament, we're going to be left still, I think, with this perception. Most of her recommendations, I think, will lead us in the directions of trying to deal with it, but it's not just the reality of whether NSI COP or she's correct. It's the broader perception that I think we're going to have to find a way of dealing with.
She talks about that word just on page 38 of the report. She says, she asks a question, did foreign interference undermine public confidence in Canadian democracy, which gets to Dick's point here. She goes, regrettably, the answer is yes, and this is perhaps the greatest harm Canada has suffered because of foreign interference and the public attention that it has now received. Much of the impact was caused by what came to light initially through the media, which did not offer a full and accurate picture of the phenomenon, which seems to blame the media. But then she says, one cannot blame the media since they worked with what they had. However, they had only incomplete pieces of information. This has been a challenge as we've navigated this war. I just wonder, with the national security culture that exists, the inability of governments or unwillingness to communicate on it directly, and then partial information coming to people like me and colleagues much better than me. How do you rebuild the trust if it's damaged by the way it's all happened and the continuing erosion of traditional media trust?
Oh, that's a $64 million question.
That's what she leaves us with in this, though, right?
She does. Yeah. She leaves us with the question, and I think she's right to say that it probably did some damage to public trust. Having said that, public trust varies over time. And it can improve depending on who's in government and how government behaves and what the issues are and so on and so forth. So I don't assume that that's kind of a continuing downhill run. It will be bumpy from time to time, but it's not going to be all downhill. It can be directed uphill again.
Right.
So I wouldn't be so negative on that point. But again, I always get driven back to the reality. If you don't have, you don't want some level of a national security culture, right, and understand that it's necessary, it's really hard to have all of the discussions that you need to have a transparent system in which you can have discussions about national security issues between government and between people and between politicians and people, in a way that resolves problems.
But Dick, with all the focus on the Don Valley North nomination and misinformation against Kenny Chu, in Richmond, Steve Sinise, I think was his riding, she comes back to the point that democracy was tested, democracy held, and things that were outside our mandate, she says misinformation and disinformation pose an even greater threat to democracy than all of this, and the transnational repression issue as well. I mean, have we been focused just too much on the wrong stuff and not focused on what she really seems to send our attention to multiple times in her report?
I think we had to focus on this. I mean, there was a real sense that there was something wrong, and I think the Canadian population was to the point where the government felt it had to do something, because I don't think it wanted to. Broadly speaking, I think you're right. I think your mandate was far too limited. We should have looked at things much, much more. She should have, had she been able, looked at things much, much more broadly. Mis and disinformation is going to affect us well beyond the electoral and democratic process systems, and we haven't even begun to come to grips with it. And when I say we, I mean countries generally in the West and elsewhere around the world. And we're going to have to find, she has a couple of recommendations in there about trying to be more open and whatnot, talk to you and your colleagues in the media, try and come up with some way of identifying, for example, when AI is used to promote disinformation. There are a whole bunch of small things you can do. They'll help. Whether it'll get us out of this imbroglio that we are in is another issue.
But just a last quick question, because trust will wax and wane, as you were saying. It will go up and downward, but we've got an election coming, one way or another. We're going to head into an election. She has 51 recommendations in this report, some of which require Parliament to act, and it seems unlikely that that is going to happen. So how confident should we be going into an election with what she lays out in terms of misinformation, disinformation, everything that's happening, without these changes implemented in a way to sort of copper fasten things a little bit?
Well, it's hard to say that we can fix the problem of social media and misinformation on social media between now and the election, or even
Ever.
because the solutions are not easy solutions, and go to the heart of democracy in any case. Having said that, I think the reality is all of the discussion we've had over the last 2 years has made people relatively hypersensitive on the subject of foreign interference, meddling. And so I suspect the reality is, apart from social media, which will go on, people are pretty, A, observant of what's going on, and B, a bunch of people are much more careful about what they want to do because they know people are watching. So in some respects, I'm not sure that I would see the next election, apart from social media problems and disinformation, which has been there for a long time. I'm not sure we're going to face any immediate threats, and apart from that, in a next election, that of the kind of things that we have been worried about over the last 2 years.
Dick, last word to you on that. You think the next election will be okay, even if these changes aren't implemented?
I think, sure. I mean, some of these things can be implemented. Parliament is not going to be able to look at things, but I think increased awareness is a good thing. Hogue does argue for greater openness and better communications on the part of the government. I think we can do that without violating national security. It will help.
Yeah, as a journalist, I would agree. That's a good thing to have people on talking about these things. Look, I want to thank you all for bringing your experience and your insight to all of our coverage on this over the last year and a half or so. Former CSIS directors Richard Fadden and Ward Elcock, thanks so much, gentlemen.
Pleasure.
Pleasure.
Well, the final report from the Foreign Interference Inquiry says there's no evidence of traitors in Canada's Parliament. But Justice Marie-Josée Hogue still had some harsh words for the Liberal government's response on foreign interference.
Certain documents never got to where they were supposed to go, and there seems to be no good reason why. I found that the government has been overall a poor communicator when it comes to foreign interference.
Hogue also took aim at a report the National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians released in June. That report caused a firestorm by saying there's intelligence that parliamentarians were semi-witting or witting participants in foreign interference attempts. Hogue's report said some of those allegations were more definitive than the underlying intelligence could support. They also sometimes contained inaccuracies, either in the way the intelligence was described or because of inaccuracies in the intelligence itself. David McGuinty is the Minister of Public Safety. McGuinty was also the chair of NSI COP when it wrote and released that report on foreign interference. He joins me now. Minister, it's good to see you again. Thanks for being here, sir.
Thanks for having me.
I'd like to start with the criticism of your former role, like the report that came out into your former role, saying that the NSI COP effectively misrepresented parliamentarians' participation in foreign interference. How do you respond to that?
Well, on behalf of my colleagues who served on the committee and did such incredible work on this, it was the third foreign interference review that was actually published by NSI COP. The first was the Prime Minister's mission to India, then two subsequent FI reviews. I think it's fair to say that there's way more in common with this report than there is in difference with this report. But I think Madam Justice Hogue explained it in a very, very systematic and thoughtful way, saying that she had access to different kinds of intelligence. She had more time to scrutinize some of it. And also remember the terms of reference. Hers is an inquiry under the Inquiries Act. ENSOCOP is a review body comprised of parliamentarians. And at that table were parliamentarians with about 150 years of political experience.
Sure.
So that may have had a bearing, of course, on interpretation as well.
Okay, but she says that the NSI COP report had the effect, and this is a quote, casting a cloud of suspicion over all parliamentarians and contributing to the erosion of Canadians' trust in their democratic institutions. I know there's a lot of overlap, but that really stands out. That's a pretty harsh rebuke of that report.
Well, I'm not sure if I take it as a rebuke. I think that she also says that no one really knows what foreign interference means. She says we need to bear down on that explanation. She says we should be leading an international initiative to figure out what it means and get a common definition. Look, David, I think the good news is we have in front of us a very good diagnosis done by Madam Justice Hogue and a prescription with remedies,
Right.
how to move forward, what recommendations we can move on quickly, which ones will take a bit more time. So I think that there's really not that much daylight, to be honest with you, having looked at this now. I haven't read the full 850 pages.
No.
Got it 3 hours ago.
Right, but, you know, contributing to the erosion of Canadians' trust in their democratic institutions. That's the very thing NSI COP was set up to avoid having happened. It was to see it, assess it, and help protect Canadian democratic institutions and intelligence. And here you are being accused by the judge of essentially having a report that has damaged it.
NSI COP is a review body.
Sure.
And its job is to review and to tell it like it is. And the interesting thing about 8 years of chairing NSI COP is we never had to hold a single vote. It was fully nonpartisan. And a group of nonpartisan politicians came together, parliamentarians, and said, we're going to park that, and we're going to do what's right for Canadians. We did our best. We made a major significant contribution. And guess what? Here we are talking about on national television. That's a good thing. Because as she said just a moment ago in her comments, we need to get Canadians engaged in this issue.
Right.
Because it transcends just our democratic processes and our institutions. She's done a fabulous job here. The other thing to keep in mind too, David, is 2019, 2021, both elections, as we at the time concluded, and she has concluded, were free and fair. Canadians should be comforted that that's the case.
Look, and I appreciate that you are here today to talk about this. And I know we've exchanged emails in the past, me trying to get you to come on the show when you were chair of NSI COP, and you put out this report to further explain it and offer context on it. And because of that role, you were unable to do it. Doesn't that need to change in this country, that all of these parts of the intelligence community, whether it's review or oversight, needs to be more transparent and communicate better, because your government is criticized for being slow to respond and not explaining the issue well to Canadians as well?
Absolutely right. We need to be more transparent, which is why at ENSOCOP we pushed out the envelope quite hard. We pushed back at government in terms of access to classified information quite regularly. So what we have now is an opportunity to improve the way that business is conducted. But I think today what we have in front of us is a really good blueprint to move forward to improve all of our response to foreign interference.
Right. Well, artificial intelligence is going to be part of it.
Well,
right?
I woke
That's
up this
very
morning,
clear.
and people might have seen the stock market in the United States and the entry of a new app coming out of China and the potential effect on information and disinformation, and the 17-point plunge of the value of one of the largest companies in the world. Look, this is not going away. It's a new normal, and I think she's captured that very well. These challenges will continue, and we're going to have to come together. I think people of good faith and goodwill, David, in Parliament now can put their swords down, I hope, and come together and make some changes. We've already introduced so many changes in the last 2 years.
That's not going to happen before the next election. There's no
I
way
think
you're
it's possible.
going to go back. You think you can go back in March and have the opposition not vote non-confidence to force you into an election?
They told
so
us
you can do this?
They told us we'd never get C-70, the Countering Foreign Interference Act, through, and we did, with all party support unanimously in very short order. If these are changes we can make that drives up trust, you alluded to it earlier, for Canadians, I think this is what we should be targeting.
So Justice Hogue concludes that essentially our democratic institutions and systems were tested, maybe in nominations, maybe in individual ridings. There could have been a material effect, but broadly the integrity of the elections held and the systems held.
And we put in place since then, David, a series of procedural safeguards that will really help protect that.
Understood, but she also makes the point that this government was too slow to respond. ineffective at explaining to Canadians what was going on.
Exactly the same wording from the NSI COP report.
Well, this is where I wanted to go with it, because she makes the point that these are essentially systemic problems. They weren't done for political motivation. They weren't done out of malice or self-interest. But, you know, Ward Elcock and Richard Fadden were here earlier, and they said this is a culture problem with this government in particular, that the Prime Minister did not want to deal with national security issues. This government did not want to deal with national security issues, and that's why we are where we today. Is where we are today? Is that a fair criticism of your government, that this just wasn't taken seriously enough?
Not at all. This government created the National Security and Intelligence Review Agency. This government created the National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians. This government passed the Countering Foreign Interference Act. This government has invested heavily in new powers for politicians to get briefed. My predecessor, Minister Mendocino, issued a ministerial order to get folks like Michael Chong briefed properly to be able to find out what was going on with he and his family. Many, many measures have been brought to bear. They are operationalized. We've got the Security and Intelligence Threats to Elections Task Force, the SITE Task Force, David. Mm-hmm. It's now engaged for the first time in Canada in our Liberal leadership race, for example. And it's in place right now to be able to oversee all elections. There are many, many procedural safeguards in place. I think we've moved forward. We have more to do.
A casualty in all of this has been MP Han Dong. He left the Liberal caucus in 2023 after a report from Global News that he had advised a Chinese diplomat to keep holding on to Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor. And she weighed in today, the judge saying that did not happen, based on a review of the intelligence. Today, he said that what Hogue wrote about parliamentarians' involvement was another major milestone in my ongoing effort to clear my name. Is he cleared now? Is he allowed back into the Liberal caucus?
That's not a question I'm seized with, to be frank with you. I haven't even looked at that. I didn't see those comments. I think that's something I'll leave to the leader and to Dominic LeBlanc, who was originally asked to look at this very carefully. I also don't know the state of any litigation he may have, so I'm very careful not to comment.
But if he left the caucus because of the allegation, and now David Johnston, the special rapporteur, has said it wasn't true, and Justice Hogue has said in her final report it wasn't true, what's the reason not to invite him back?
I can't comment on the reason to invite him or not invite him back. What I can say is I'm sure the government, I'm sure the Prime Minister and the Minister of Finance, who's been seized with this and tasked with this, will be looking at it.
One of the points she makes is that, you know, through all the challenges democracy held, but she pivots back to a couple of times in her report, issues that are outside the mandate: misinformation, disinformation, and transnational repression. Mm-hmm. And it says this is what we should really be focusing on, is the message I take from what she's written. And she calls misinformation and disinformation an existential threat to our democracy, calls transnational repression a genuine scourge. She said a lot of that is outside her mandate. So how do you tackle that now? Because we've got an election coming at some point this year, and all of this is going to be in play.
We're going to do everything we can to take the recommendations she's made to public safety and the organizations and agencies that I'm responsible for. I've asked my officials to pour through those now to find out what we can implement, how quickly, do they require legislation, are there funding implications? But she's right. She's right. Here's the good news. We are having this discussion on national news. 5 years ago, we weren't. Now people are in Canada are asking questions. We've introduced the concept of foreign interference, but she's also very clear. She says, I can't really tell you what foreign interference means. We need to get a clear definition. We need to get it into our frontline police services. It's different from foreign influence, for example,
sure,
which is overt and normal and diplomatic. So I think right now we are catching up, certainly to the Australians and to the Americans. This is a global phenomenon. It's accelerating in pace and consequence, but we've put in place a series of institutions that are helping us monitor this carefully. We'll report to Canadians, but there's work to do.
Okay, but you know, the part of like, after going through the special rapporteur process and then David Johnston essentially being burned to the ground because of the politics of the moment, this inquiry was meant to deliver a series of recommendations to put in place safeguards for the next election. That next election could come within days of Parliament returning. So how do you reassure Canadians that the safeguards are in place if there are no legislative changes, if there is no extra money for things, because Parliament has been prorogued because of the situation it was in and the leadership race your party is having now, and there's no runway to do these things before we all hit the campaign trail?
March 26th isn't the end of the world.
Might be the end of the Parliament, though,
maybe,
right?
Maybe not. We have a fixed term election date. It's October 20th, 2025. And I think people of good faith and goodwill may very well come together. Maybe Canadians can ask that of their elected representatives. Maybe they can ask them to go back and do their work particularly if it requires reform to make sure that the next election is even freer and fairer than the last two that were assessed. I think everything's possible, David. I remain hopeful. I'm going to continue working with my critics from other parties. I've been reaching out to them lately, looking for their input, their thoughtful contributions. I think we owe it to Canadians.
Mr. Blanchet said today, let's have an election. Pierre Poilievre says every day, let's have an election. Jagmeet Singh doesn't seem inclined, though his position seems a little bit more malleable depending on things, but doesn't seem inclined to give you another day in government beyond the next confidence vote. So have you even talked to them about doing this?
I think there's obviously one track is here, which I'm fixated on, which is these responsibilities, the border, for example. But there's also another track on this question of tariffs in the United States. It may very well be that we're going to need a response in this country. It may very well be that we're going to need to reconvene the House of Commons. I don't think many politicians today would risk incurring the wrath of good Canadians and hundreds of thousands of small and medium-sized companies by saying, no, we want to block Parliament from going forward and getting a package to be able to assist with this. I think right now we need to see what happens in Washington as we monitor it and as we continue our efforts to hopefully have a positive influence. I'm certainly trying to remind my colleagues, it's the longest undefended border in the world for a reason and has been for 150 odd years. So there's lots of progress to be made, David. I remain hopeful.
White House press secretary said today, though, February 1 is still on. That's when the tariffs are coming for Canada and Mexico. And she said Donald Trump told her that last night. Does this mean the border plan wasn't good enough?
No, I don't think this is a direct correlation to the border plan. I think we've made so much progress. I'm heading down to Washington, D.C. this week. I'll be meeting with a number of senior officials. What we're hearing back is this is very encouraging. There's a huge amount of cooperation. And I think what many millions of Americans know, they know it instinctively and they know it experientially. They know that we win together or we lose together. And so right now, I can't really divine what's happening in the White House. None of us really can. But we're going to go forward positively, David, hopefully, and to remind our American friends just how interconnected we are and how much is at stake for both of our peoples and our economies.
Just one last question, because we've gone over time. We know that Cabinet and departments are kicking around options for support and aid should it be required, right? The Prime Minister said this on January 8th, and it's moved to a more advanced stage. If you want to get that through, relief for businesses and workers who will be affected by whatever Donald Trump does, you need to reach out to the opposition, just like you need to reach out to the opposition on this foreign interference recommendations. Has your government started doing that? Do you have any sense whether Mr. Poilievre, Mr. Singh, Mr. Blanchet, because Mr. Blanchet said today, if you want to get this on, just have an election. I mean, have you got a path? Have you got a partner? Have you had those conversations?
I'll leave that to the Prime Minister right now. I think that this is entirely doable and possible. People of goodwill and good faith can put the interests of Canadians ahead of their own political interests. They can put country ahead of party. I know that sounds like a slogan, but it's not. I think we actually have to really focus in on people's well-being. Because right now, David, here's what I'm hearing. People are frightened. They're worried. They're worried about their businesses. They're worried about their jobs. And we get that. I certainly get that.
Right.
Which is why I'm fixating so much on the border.
But you know the Prime Minister waiting so long to announce his resignation and then proroguing Parliament. The opposition says that's what the Liberals are doing, right? They are putting the party ahead of the country by mothballing Parliament at a time of great crisis.
Well, that's one assessment. I don't agree with it.
I didn't think you would.
I think we just keep moving forward.
Okay. All right. Public Safety Minister David McGuinty, we appreciate the time. As more comes out, we hope you will come back to continue this conversation.
Thank you, David.
We appreciate your time.
Thank you.